Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Carlene Gilmore, Director of Marketing here at PBI Research. PBI is the leading provider of death audit and locate services. We've been evolving the market for 30 years, helping organizations like yourself minimize overpayments, locate participants and beneficiaries, reduce fraud, and save time and resources. Today's webinar will be recorded, and each of you will receive a link to the recording after the webinar. We'll also be saving about 5 minutes at the end to answer questions. If you have a question, enter it in the questions box on the right side of your screen. So now I'll introduce our two presenters today. So first, Mark Sweatman. Mark is an industry veteran and has been in the market for over 19 years. He is a guru in industry guidelines and has shared his knowledge at several industry conferences across the nation by speaking on topics such as participant risks, lost participants, and uncashed checks. Mark has a Bachelor of Science in Marketing from Westchester University. Also joining us today is Lindsay Tate McDonald. Lindsay is PBI's Director of Client Services. Lindsay joined us in 2015 and spent the last 5 years working for operations and sales, focusing on our locate product and services. Lindsay graduated from California State University of Sacramento with a bachelor's degree in marketing as well. So with that said, I'll hand it off to you, Mark, to kick us off.
Great, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see me and hear me. Appreciate everybody's time this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are, to talk about certainly a very hot topic, locating services and how to meet your fiduciary responsibilities. What we're going to do today, as I take a look at the agenda here, is cover a few things. An overview of lost or missing participants, the current regulatory climate, which I'll get into a little bit, oddly enough, has changed slightly as of yesterday, and then risk to your organization, and then I'll turn it over to Lindsay to discuss solutions to mitigate these types of risks. And as Carlene had mentioned, we'll leave some time for questions and answers at the end. So when we're talking about an overview of lost or missing participants, what I like to do is really give a little bit of a background about who they are, how they occur. And one of the things that we've found over the years is in consulting and talking and seeing participant information from TPAs, record keepers, government plans, pension plans, plan sponsors, we know that missing participants are roughly a 10 to 15% problem within participant files when it comes to address records. A bigger concern, or something that adds on top of that, I should say, is information that's inaccurate or incomplete, which is very important, especially in this day and age, as there's scrutiny around this issue, to do the best you can to have as complete a record on the participants as possible. Things like missing social security numbers, date of birth, phone numbers, spousal information, email addresses, beneficiary contact information. All of these things help when you're looking to locate and confirm current addresses for missing participants. So for purposes of today, we categorize missing participant problems in two terminated employee buckets: active plans, and then also in terminated or abandoned plans. We're not going to focus on that area so much today, but focus more on missing participants in active plans and how best to mitigate those types of risks. I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of take a step back and show, for those that perhaps this is maybe a newer scenario or issue or area of focus, where most of these missing participants lie, how it occurs, personal circumstances that are listed there. At the root, when you look at a basic scenario around a missing participant, you have a former employee who still is in the plan. They left the company, they're moving around and perhaps not making you aware of their new address. You're going to mail out an annual funding notice or a quarterly statement, and it gets returned undeliverable, whether that's back to you as the fiduciary plan sponsor, perhaps to a provider like your TPA or record keeper. That really starts the problem around missing participants. We flag that account on the system to identify them uniquely as missing participants. So that's really the crux of how they begin, if you will. One of the things that I like to mention as well is there is an unknown risk, and sometimes it's greater than your missing participant risk. And where that comes from is participants that don't live at the address where you're mailing, but the mail gets through. And this can happen a variety of ways. Most common is a separation or a divorce where your participant lives somewhere else. The mail is getting through to their former residence, and there's a former spouse or a separated spouse living there that's getting that information, but it may not be getting to your participant. So the mail gets through. This can happen for years, by the way, any of these scenarios where you think the information is good because no mail is getting returned to tell you otherwise. You're paying for that account every year to have mailings occur. The mail's getting through. You think everything's great. You have good information on this individual, but in reality, you don't. I know Lindsay will touch on some of those types of scenarios in the service that we leverage to help in those particular instances. So I wanted to call that out. Other scenarios where that may occur, let's say you bought a new house or you've lived in your current residence for years, but you get mail from mailed and delivered to you for the former resident. And perhaps at this point you throw the mail in the trash. Needless to say, that's a problem where mail's getting through, but you as the plan sponsor or fiduciary doesn't understand that that participant doesn't live there any longer. So what are plan sponsors doing today? We don't see it as much at this point, but certainly there are some that are still doing nothing. These tend to be smaller plans. I could give an example. Let's say you have someone who owns an auto body shop, and they have a benefit they're offering to their employees, a 401k plan. There's only 10 participants in the plan. And that owner of that auto body really is making their money under the hood of a car and wants to, the primary responsibility is being a lead mechanic, right? And earning their wage that way. Their understanding around fiduciary risks and ERISA requirements and what they need to do around missing participants is completely different than someone that may be with a medium or large size organization. So we don't see it as much anymore, but certainly if a mailing goes out and the returns go back to that plan sponsor, they receive that undeliverable mail, they might throw it in their drawer and never really understand what they need to do about fixing that. We do see companies conducting searches. I think that's pretty common, not something that needs a lot of explanation, but I will say as a risk management company, you don't want to necessarily just take the results of a search and change the address on your system. You want to make sure that that participant who is missing or lost confirms their address for you and acknowledges that change to your system, which leads you to the next step, which is a search and a confirmation mailing or a series of confirmation mailings. These are effective. The audit trail can be a little bit disjointed. How many do you do? Who's going to get this communication? How is that being communicated? What was the result of that communication? All of that should really be wrapped up in an audit trail report so you can effectively show what you've done to address missing participants and the results. The last two pieces there are, if folks are familiar with old efforts that were available through our government, the IRS had a program and the Social Security Administration. If you haven't tackled this issue in quite a while, you may still be familiar with these programs that are not existent any longer. So the current regulatory climate, and I touched on the fact that there was a release yesterday, which kind of changed things, oddly enough, for this conversation, from the Department of Labor that I would encourage you all to take a look at. Came out yesterday, and the piece that would be most pertinent to today's conversation would be the best practices. There was 3 releases, the best practices link, if you will. You'll probably see it in an email. So with that, it takes a lot of what we're going to talk about in one of the steps and is identifying best practices that the Department of Labor believes that sponsors should potentially undertake. What is left out, as usual, is how frequently do we do this in order to address missing participants. And it says you may want to do some or all of these. Again, another fun way for plan sponsors to not be 100% sure exactly what they need to do to address missing participants. So when you look at fiduciary responsibility when under ERISA, one of the things that this leads to is high-level conversations within your companies to ask questions like, how best do we want to address this issue to make sure that we're complying under ERISA? How often do we address missing participants or try to locate missing participants? This can be different based off of the type of organization you are. If you're a state or government entity, if you're a large corporate entity, if you are retail tends to have a lot of different challenges than maybe a large strictly corporate environment company, where folks tend to be, not always, but a younger demographic. They move around quite a bit. They don't necessarily stay with the plan very long, so high turnover. They present a whole different set of challenges, which might require the need to look at your missing participants on a more frequent basis. You know, when you look at that type of thing, auto enrollment can create some, although it's meant for good, it can create challenges in this type of scenario, because that education at the store level may not be occurring. That individual was automatically enrolled in the 401k plan, as an example. The store down the end of the mall is paying an extra 50 cents an hour, so they leave, but they're in college and they're moving back to college, or they're living with their friends in apartments or going back home in the summer. So they're moving around quite a bit, and you have a larger percentage of missing population, if you will. So if you're in a retail organization and some others where that might be the scenario, you might want to look at your missing participant population on a more frequent basis. So inconsistencies and confusion for fiduciaries. The Department of Labor started looking at this, aggressively starting back in 2015, started with DB plans, large plans. And a lot of it is around, and even with the IRS, is they frown upon someone who should be receiving their benefit by a certain age and are not. When that happens, why did that happen? And if they can backtrack into a lot of this is inaccurate data due to acquisitions, mergers, older companies that had tons of acquisitions, so that participant over time with different providers, some information may have been dropped off. So the records aren't necessarily consistent, and also the fact that they have missing participants, right? So if the fiduciary or the plan sponsor was doing a good job keeping track of these records all along, there'd be less likelihood that that participant wouldn't be able to make get their distribution on time. The IRS has a memorandum too that you might want to take a look at from 2017, which identifies something similar, and when they may have a concern if this person's 75 and never took a distribution, they may be subject to a penalty on that from a tax perspective. They're going to go back to the plan sponsor and see whether they were following some steps that they feel is prudent in order to make sure that they had good, accurate information on these participants. The Department of Labor Assistance Bulletin. This was something that a lot of plan sponsors started to look towards from a conservative approach to address missing participants in the last few years. It has some steps. The challenge was this field assistance bulletin in 2014 was specific to terminating defined contribution plans where you have missing or non-responsive participants. So it wasn't necessarily the vast majority of plans that have an active plan with missing participants, but with lack of additional information out there, folks started to look towards that as a way to mitigate their missing participant problem. As of yesterday, with those best practices, I will say these steps that are in that field assistance bulletin from 2014 appear to now be in the best practices for DC and DB plans that are active, not just terminating. So you're going to see that now as actually steps that the Department of Labor suggests as best practices. So what type of risk is there to your organizations? When you're investigated by our friends, where they frown upon is there's no documented policy to address missing participants. If there is a documented policy, is it being followed? You can't say you're going to do an annual effort to address missing participants, and when they ask for your records and the last time you did results and or efforts and the results, they find that it's been 2 years since you did it last. That'll be a problem. Confusion around who's responsible. Is the plan sponsor doing the lost or missing participant process, or are you relying on a provider to do that for you? Have you recently left that provider and perhaps you haven't made your new provider aware of what your policy is for them to follow? One thing that's pretty consistent is having an inadequate process in place. When our clients have been visited by or have had these investigations, it's pretty consistent that the feedback is you need to do more. There tends to be little palate for how much it may cost the plan sponsor. They believe that really you should be doing everything. So I think this guidance that came out yesterday will be a lot more helpful to outline for plan sponsors and fiduciaries best practices to undertake, a little bit better about what you should do, that I think is going to obviously come into play here in the future. So the ultimate outcome here, if they're dissatisfied in any way, is the potential for fines and penalties for you as a plan sponsor or fiduciary. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay to take a look at solutions to mitigate these risks.
All right, great. Thank you, Mark. So now that we have a better understanding of what our fiduciary responsibilities are, let's talk about ways of meeting those responsibilities. Where I like to start off is let's identify the reason behind the searches and determine the risk level associated with those reasons. So here I've highlighted 2 of our most commonly used locate services. The first service is our unconfirmed locate service. This is used for relatively low risk populations, and reasons that could be lower risk could be things such as annual funding notices, regulatory mailings, and plan updates. We determine that the risk is lower because there's no benefits that are due at this time or in the near future, or there's any changes to the plans that would result in the timing of when those benefits would start for those participants, such as a terminating plan. Unconfirmed locate takes the name and the SSN of the participants, and they identify a single best known address. We call the service unconfirmed because it is just that. PBI is not sending out any communication to these participants and verifying that the address that was identified is correct. It's still up to you to reach out to the participants and confirm this information yourself. Return mail is still a possibility with a service. So you may be asking yourself, if the service is bringing back a single best known address, why are we receiving this returned mail? So we all have a unique identifier, which is our social security number. Commercial databases utilizes a person's SSN to gather information such as addresses, date of birth, and phone numbers. They pull this information from mainly applications that require you to fill in your social. So some things could be car and mortgage loans, credit card applications, motor vehicle registrations, for example. Where the discrepancy comes in is when these participants, sometimes they could have more than one home that they live at, right? So they could have a summer home and a winter home. They could have rental properties, or they could have co-signed for a loan for a family member. So an example that I like to use is, let's say you have a child that's moved away to college and you've opened a credit card, you've co-signed on that loan for them. So now what's popping up is actually your child's college address, right? Instead of your address that you actually live at. So those are some things that you kind of need to think about when you're looking at those results. So you can use this unconfirmed service proactively or reactively. So some may decide to use it before they have a large mailing go out to try to eliminate the risk of return mail, or some can use it after a mailings has gone out and you've received back non-deliverable mail, and you can try to obtain a better address. Our second service that we're going to go over is our fiduciary locate service. So again, let's discuss some of the reasons why you would use a service like this. These would be our higher risk populations. So participants nearing a retirement age, plan terminations, maybe they're eligible to commence. And of course, you can use this service to locate beneficiaries of deceased participants. So Mark, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So PBI specifically designed the fiduciary locate service to address recommendations that the DOL, IRS, and PBGC has set forth on what they would like to see done in attempts to locate missing participants. So we'll walk through this service quickly because I know we're getting close to time. So the fiduciary locate service is about a 10 to 12-week process depending on the file size. Again, the service utilizes name and SSN like the unconfirmed search does. And it also, we can obtain the last known address you have on file. We take the last known address because based on one of the guidelines that we've seen, they want to see that you have a documented process of mailing to the last known address you have on file. This is an optional data point that you can choose to submit or not. If you, let's say that you've already have it well documented on your side, you can choose to not include that information and we'll simply mail out to PBI best known addresses instead. Once a file received on PBI's side, we do a comprehensive death audit using our CertaDeath products. CertaDeath pulls in SSA, DMF, state, and also use those obituaries to help identify deaths. We have a team that reviews those obituaries and identifies additional deaths where no death record exists. There's multiple reasons why we would do a death audit. Obviously, the clear one is to identify deceased participants on your file, and then we can in turn attempt to locate beneficiaries for you. But it also helps clean up information in your file. So if there's any name changes, somebody got married, their last name's changed, it can help identify invalid social security numbers, and we can attempt to correct those for you. Next, we'll be preparing for the actual mailing. We typically use two standard letters, one for locating a living participant and confirming or updating their address. And then the other would be for those participants that we did identify as deceased. We will use the deceased participant's address history and mail letters out to those addresses instead. And in the body of the letter, it'll clearly state that we're looking for a surviving spouse or another beneficiary. Once the mailing has started, we send out letters every 2 weeks. If a participant has confirmed their information, that outreach will stop for that participant, and you'll receive weekly reports of the information that we've obtained during the week. So the participant's name, the address that they've confirmed, same thing if it's a beneficiary, the relationship to the deceased. The participants can confirm their address multiple ways. So they can return the bottom portion of the letter. They can call in. We have a full-time call center. We also have an online portal. So every letter has a unique reference number and letter ID code. They plug those two numbers in successfully. It pulls up the same information that is listed on the letter. So the reason for the search, the company that they worked for, and allows them to confirm or update their address as well. It also can obtain additional information such as phone numbers, date of birth, and email addresses that will pass along the information to you. Once mailings have been completed, we'll move on to making outbound phone calls. We'll make up to 2 outbound phone calls. We'll also identify social media links with emphasis on LinkedIn and Facebook. The final step of the search is optional. We can send out a certified letter to any participant that has still not confirmed their address through the mailings and phone calls to a single address that did not come back as non-deliverable. Mark, if you can move to the next slide, please. What you receive at the end of this service is 2 things. You will receive an Excel file of all the information that we have obtained during the search. So all of your found participants, your found beneficiaries, any exceptions that we encountered along the way, which could be maybe a participant called in and refused to give information, or maybe they stated that they've confirmed their address directly with you instead. And then also you'll have a list of non-found participants. In this list will be the same, similar to these letters that you can see in front of you. So we provide you with PDFs of participant-specific information, and it details exactly what we did in efforts to locate your missing participants. So I'll have the participant's name, it'll have the date that we conducted the death audit, the date that we retrieved the addresses that we were attempting to mailing to. You'll receive all the addresses that we attempted, the dates that we mailed, and the response in each scenario. So did they come back as non-deliverable, or did they just not respond? You'll also receive the phone numbers that were attempted, and again, the dates that we attempted them and what happened in each scenario. Did we leave a message? Was it a wrong phone number? You'll get the social media links that we identified, and if you choose to do a certified letter, you also have those details, the dates that we mailed them, the address that we mailed to, the tracking ID number, and what resulted. So it's a very complete process that you can save for your records. That's all time-stamped, which is exactly what we have understood of what DOL, IRS, and is looking for when you're looking for missing participants. Mark, if you can go to our last slide, please. So let's talk about best practices. So these are just things that you should be thinking about before it comes to a fire drill and now you need to find these participants right away. So have a documented process in place in mind. A lot of our clients include our services along in that process. You should be cleaning up and doing a search at least once a year, whether you're using the unconfirmed search or fiduciary locate search. Determine triggers of when you should start thinking about doing these services. So do you wait till you have uncashed checks, till you receive return mail, maybe some payments aren't being processed in a timely manner? You should also think about your population that's getting near to a retirement age. And then also a big one is searching for beneficiaries. A lot of times we get clients that submit participants that have been deceased and they've known they've been deceased for 5, 10, 15 years. The longer you wait, the harder it is to find those beneficiaries, just because of the information about those deceased participants falls out of commercial databases, so it's much harder to find. So with that, I'm going to open it up, turn it back over to Carlene, and address any questions that have come in throughout this webinar.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay and Mark. Before I ask the couple questions here, I am going to launch a poll. If everybody could please participate. One basic question about the information that we offered here today. And with that said, I'll ask one of the questions, starting with, are you able to capture email and phone numbers?
So yes, we are. So unconfirmed service will also, not only will it return a single best known address, it can offer phone numbers and date of birth where it's available. The fiduciary service I did go over a little bit. We can, if the participants call into our call center, we can confirm or update their address as well as obtain a date of birth and phone number, as well as if the participant goes on to our online portal. We can make fields that are mandatory for those participants to fill out so we can obtain information such as date of birth, phone number, and email addresses.
Perfect. And I think we have time for one more question. For weekly death reports, how soon would it take for a new death to show up?
Yeah, I can take that. It really depends on the source. So the death master file can take a little bit. The ability to get obituaries tends to be quicker. So it can happen within that week, but it really depends on when that information becomes available. I think that's a good question though, Carlene, because I do want to call out the difference between a missing participant problem where a moment in time with a data file that might be looked at annually of the problem identifies some deceased as Lindsay had mentioned as part of the process. That should not replace a death audit process, which would be a continuous monitoring type of effort to avoid to avoid overpayments or potential for fraud, right? Those happen much more frequently on a daily basis. Folks can pass away, as we all know, versus a missing participant problem. So they're kind of two unique participant risks that have a different mitigation approach to them. So for purposes of today, it was missing participants. The deceased that you would find would be a part of what Lindsay had mentioned with the fiduciary locate process on your missing participants only, not your whole term vested and in pay population.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. So we do have other questions that we didn't get to today. So for those of you that submitted a question, we will follow up and make sure we get you everything you need and the answers you're looking for. But I would just like to say thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And please reach out if you have anything else or need any other information. Have a great afternoon.